Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, we're going to look at a passage in the second movement in which a group of instruments maintains a static tempo while the rest of the orchestra slows down, which is the opposite of what takes place during the collapse section, which we covered in the previous video, in which the strings maintain a static tempo and the rest of the orchestra accelerates on top of them. So let's take a look at it. Okay, the passage we're discussing is the lead-up to the Vanity Fair section, in which the solo piano has an extended solo against a very light accompaniment by just a few instruments in the orchestra. The lead-up to that passage involves the full orchestra, though, with a special sequence of temporally desynchronous effects involving first a subset of the orchestra's players, and then second, just one or two of those players who may or may not be placed on stage. We'll begin by looking at the notation as Ives left it. Then we'll read Ives's gloss on the passage and his conductor's note. Then we'll finally revisit the passage in the new performance score to show how the renotation clarifies Ives's intent. This will be the same process that we followed when analyzing the collapse section in that video. For context in the program, we're back on the train in the Celestial Railroad story. In the passage, we hear the train wheels slowing, represented in the score by a triplet pattern performed by the percussion, bassoon, and saxophone, right up here. Bum bum ba-dum. Bum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum. I'll call this the train wheel group going forward. This really stands out in the texture when it's first heard, but notice it's curious that the main orchestra goes into 5/4, except for the instruments playing the triplets. They stay in 4/4. But this isn't polytemporal, it's polymetric. The quarter note in the 4/4 group is the same as the quarter note in the 5/4 group. Now look at what happens in the violin 2 section on this page. One measure after the train wheel triplets start, the second violins drop out except for two players. Ives writes, two only, one if not many strings, and he marks them as extra violin 2. Okay, so we have one or two violinists from the violin 2 section repeating this odd figure. Bum, ba-da-dum, 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 ba-da-dum. Spoiler alert, this is a cell modeled on the Mr. Smooth It Away theme that will be heard shortly in the Beulah section, and the extra violin 2 would appear to be Mr. Smooth It Away himself here, and for the rest of the movement, wherever the extra violin 2 is heard. Now, when we turn to the next page, we'll see the train wheel group continue with its triplets in 4/4, but at the end of the page, Ives finishes their music in 5/4, again with quarter equals quarter between the train wheel group and the main orchestra. So, their 5/4 measure balances with the 5/4 measure the main orchestra had on the previous page. So the two groups end on a common bar line at the end of the page, here. But what about the extra violin 2? It continues the Mr. Smooth It Away pattern that it played on the previous page. Nothing too surprising there. Then, on the next page, we're presented with the Mr. Smooth It Away theme proper in the first violins. Da 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 da. Below, the extra violin 2 continues its pattern, but now is only one player. Ives writes one only. So we've dropped one of the two extra violin 2 players, and only one of them continues on. But then notice the other instruction Ives writes here. This keeps previous tempo. What does this mean? The main orchestra here is slower than it had been. It's now at quarter equals 92. It had decelerated from an initial tempo of quarter equals 112 to 120, down to quarter equals 96 to 108 at the end of the previous page. So it looks like the extra violin 2 is to keep the tempo of the previous page here. But then look at the end of the page. There's a poco tenuto above a fermata and a gap just before the final bar line. So the orchestra seems to stop for a second or two. Also, notice that the extra violin 2 has no pause written in that gap. So it must not stop playing during that pause. When we turn the page, we've arrived at Vanity Fair in the Celestial Railroad story. The solo piano is accompanied by just a few of the instruments here, and the extra violin 2 is one of them. Notice the notation for that part, though. There's a quick finishing of its previous pattern, then it starts the pattern anew, and repeat brackets. Bum, bidadum, bidadum. Looking up the score, you'll see the low bells are synchronized with the extra violin 2 for this repeating measure, striking the structural tones of the pattern. Bum, 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 bum. Just after that, an extra viola marked one only comes in, playing In the Sweet By and By. Notice, though, that Ives writes continues allegro for the extra violin 2 on this page. Was it actually playing allegro before? What's going on here? Well, just as with the collapse section, the way to find out is to look at Ives's conductor's note and see if he glossed the passage. And he did. Referencing measures 114 through 118, he wrote the following. Percussion and bassoons. All the percussion with the saxophones or bassoons play in section 20, rightly section 21, as a single and independent group. If phrased in fives, it is clearer in playing. There may be a slight ritardando as well as decrescendo of the main orchestra in this passage, which may extend into section 22. If so, they, the saxophones and percussion, wait at the end of the 5/4 measure, measure 118, and begin at the conductor's beat at section 22, measure 119. If so, one of their number acting as a leader for these few measures will simplify the playing. Also, Ives writes about extra violin 2 for this passage. This does not slow down with the rest of the orchestra, but continues same time or faster, triple piano, as though in distance. Better to have extra violin in back of orchestra or off stage. Okay, what does this all mean? It'll become clear when we correlate it with the score itself. So here we're back looking at the beginning of the passage in the full score. In the conductor's note at rehearsal 21, Ives writes that the percussion and the bassoons act as their own group, right? 21. All the percussion with the saxophones or bassoons play as a single and independent group. Okay, there's something independent about what they're doing. He goes on to state, there may be a slight ritardando as well as decrescendo of the main orchestra in this passage, which may extend into section 22. Well, what is that? He does mark a ritardando in measure 116 that's going down to 96 to 108 right here, which may extend into section 22, which is on the next page, right? So he seems to be saying that the percussion and the bassoons are playing independently, so they're holding their tempo while the rest of the orchestra slows down. Okay, that's quite a performance complexity. Now, what about the other complexity here? The extra violin 2. It does not slow down with the rest of the orchestra. Ives writes that at measure 115, it does not slow down with the rest of the orchestra, but continues same time or faster. Well, where is that? It's back here, where it enters. It does not slow down with the rest of the orchestra. In other words, it's with the train wheel group, right? It continues at the same time or faster, triple piano as though in distance. Better to have in back of orchestra or off stage. Okay, we'll save the off-stage component of the instruction for later. What's important is that it's not slowing down. Neither is the train wheel group, the percussion and the saxophone. And then later, at measure 119, rehearsal 22, where it switches to one player only, Ives marks that it's to keep the previous tempo. Aha! Now it all adds up. The percussion and bassoon, and then the extra violin 2, first two players, are maintaining their tempo, a faster tempo, while the rest of the orchestra slows down. Ives writes that the percussion and the bassoon are supposed to wait at the end of their 5/4 bar, which is this bar right here. In the note, Ives wrote, the saxophone and percussion wait at the end of the 5/4 measure, measure 118, and begin again at the conductor's beat at section 22, measure 119. So, they will have finished the passage before the rest of the orchestra, because they've been playing at a faster rate of speed. So they'll have to wait at the end of their 5/4 bar for the rest of the orchestra to catch up with them. But then, after they've come to the end of the 5/4 bar, the extra violin 2, which has been playing along with them, will continue on at that tempo. It doesn't pause here. It just keeps going, noodling the repeating pattern into the next page, and then through the pause that the rest of the orchestra takes at the end of that page. The pause reveals its existence to the audience, and incidentally is such a funny and Ivesian thing to do. It then keeps playing that pattern as the orchestra starts again at the beginning of the next page, and is then joined by the bells. Now it all makes sense, but the question then becomes, how do you represent this, first for the conductor in the score, and then for the players in their part? Let's take a look at the performance score, which solves this problem. Here we see the correlative measures in the performance score. The first large-scale thing to point out is that the location of the 5/4 bar that was at the beginning of the passage for the main orchestra, but at the end of the passage for the train wheel group, has been standardized. It's at the beginning of the passage for both groups now. Because the passage involves multiple tempos occurring simultaneously, an assistant conductor is certainly required, as I have suggested in his note. So, at rehearsal 21, the assistant conductor cues the saxophone, bassoon, and percussion to establish a strict tempo. Then, in the very next measure, the same assistant conductor needs to cue the extra violin 2, which is 2 players initially, to join the train wheel group, and therefore follow the assistant conductor. But remember, everyone is playing at the same rate of speed on this page. It's on the next page that things break down. On that page, a ritardando is applied to the main orchestra, while the train wheel group maintains its strict tempo independently. To convey the temporal dyssynchrony, the train wheel group ends graphically before the rest of the orchestra, as you can see here. They will wait at the end of the third measure until the rest of the orchestra catches up with them. But remember, at the beginning of the next page, in the original score, the extra violin 2 switches from 2 players to 1 player. Because the extra violin 2 is playing with the train wheel group, the measure where it switches to 1 player happens in the gap after the train wheel group ends. So we've pulled that measure for a single extra violin 2 player from the next page back to this page to show that when the train wheel group stops, the extra violin 2 part keeps going. The gap is equal in width to the amount of space required for that measure. This actually may suggest that when the train wheel group stops, that there's several seconds after that point before the rest of the orchestra gets to the end of the page. But if you take Ives's tempos as written, though, then that's not the case. The two groups are almost on top of each other. How to handle the tempos here to produce the intended effect is important and is really a separate topic, so it's covered in a separate video that follows this one. But now back to the logistics of the notation. On the next page, everyone except for the extra violin 2 is synchronized again. Notice there's an instruction for the saxophone, bassoon, and percussion to resynchronize with the orchestra. But look at the extra violin 2 part. Again, it's just 1 player at this point, and it keeps the previous tempo, which is faster than the rest of the orchestra, which is playing at about quarter equals 92. The extra violin 2 repeats its pattern across the page and, importantly, across the poco tenuto pause, where everyone else drops out to reveal the wayward violinist. In my travels with this score before it was published, conductors asked me how long the pause should be. And I thought, well, probably about 3 seconds. It shouldn't be so short that you can't hear the extra violin 2 part in isolation, but it also shouldn't be so long that it showcases the player unnecessarily. So I thought maybe about 3 seconds. When conductors used that, it worked well. So, editorially, it's added to the score as a suggestion in brackets. Moving ahead to the next page, the extra violin 2 part continues its pattern as the rest of the orchestra advances to Vanity Fair. Shortly after the piano solo begins, the extra violin 2 player has to be cued again, this time to begin coordinating with the low bell, which is striking structural tones in its pattern. So, bum, ba-da-dum, and bum, bum, bum. Following that, the extra viola also has to be cued to come in, also playing at a different tempo. Okay, this seems to clarify Ives's intentions in the full score, but how do you communicate this to the players, specifically to the players tasked with the extra violin 2 part, which starts off with 2 players and then becomes 1 player? Well, it's assigned to the desk 6 part of the second violin section. Why back there? Ives suggests it in the conductor's note. He seems to like the effect of hearing players who've gotten out of step with the main orchestra coming somewhere from the back of the section. There's a famous story of a read-through of Ives's Decoration Day by the New Symphony Orchestra under the baton of Paul Eisler in Carnegie Hall in 1920. According to Ives, the entire orchestra kept falling apart at the end of each section of the piece, except for one solitary player at the back of the violin section who never got lost and who just kept playing. That may have inspired Ives to write this passage, which is an inversion of sorts of what happened during that read-through. We have a player who's gotten lost and is then revealed, still bowing away independently within the orchestra. But at any rate, it's assigned to 2 players in the violin 2 section. But, as Ives writes, it could be played by players who are spatially removed from the main orchestra and who are set away at some distance. So, the part set contains separate parts for players who may be covering the extra parts if those players are not sitting in the main orchestra. First, though, let's turn to the violin 2 desk 6 part to see how it's laid out. As a side note, all the string parts are divided up by desk, because of the complexity of the divisi and the strings throughout the entire symphony. That's covered in a separate video. Here, just know that it works to the player's advantage. Since the two players initially play together but then diverge, with one player rejoining the main violin 2 section, and since the extra part is temporally independent from the rest of the violin 2 section, it's not possible to present the music of both players in conventional systems. The only way to do it is to present the two parts on facing pages, with each player reading one of the two pages. Here, player 2 is reading from the page on the left. Meanwhile, player 1 is reading from the page on the right. Initially, they're reading the very same music. This system at the top of the left-hand page is the same as the system on the top of the right-hand page. Both players are with the main orchestra at that point. And in the second measure of that system, they both join the train wheel group, which is establishing a strict tempo that will not change during the orchestra's upcoming ritardando. Then, on the next system down, their tempo is maintained during that ritardando, and the note above it states, maintain previous tempo coordinated with your stand partner, saxophone, bassoon, percussion. Do not follow ritardando with rest of orchestra. Notice that this system is identical across the two pages, except for the bar line at the end. Player 1 stops and waits for the rest of the orchestra to catch up with the train wheel group, but player 2 continues on. Player 2 becomes the solitary extra violin 2 player who continues on independently of the rest of the orchestra. So, player 2 continues noodling its figure, while player 1 rejoins the main violin 2 section and is therefore playing again with the main orchestra. At the end of measure 148, player 1, and of course the rest of the orchestra, reaches the poco tenuto of about 3 seconds that we saw in the full score. It exposes the pattern that the other player, now the only extra violin 2 player, has been sawing away at through this passage, indicated with the wiggly line and arrow, both here and back in the full score. Next, we advance to the Vanity Fair section at rehearsal 23. Just after it begins, extra violin 2 is cued to coordinate with the low bells, and so the bell part is cued in full beneath it, with arrows showing the coincidence of structural tones between the two parts. After that, the player simply continues to vamp its pattern in tandem with the low bells. Notice that player 1 has been playing music with the main violin 2 section throughout the vamp, including a pizzicato that has to be specially coordinated with the percussion. Then, at measure 160, player 1 plays 2 notes arco and then begins to pluck pizzicato double stops that player 2 is supposed to play as well. When the pizzicato passage begins, the extra violin 2 is to stop, so player 1 must cue player 2 to stop and rejoin the main orchestra. In the instruction, cue player 2 is added above its tempo there. Player 2 correspondingly has a cue of the 2 arco notes that will be played by its stand partner. That will signal that it's about to stop its vamp, and moments later, player 1 should cue it to rejoin the main violin 2 section. Now, this is admittedly complex, but I can see no other way of presenting this without doing this side-by-side page division. But this is not unique. I got the inspiration for this split page notation from working on complex percussion parts in John Adams' pieces. David Ocker, Adams' primary copyist, had devised this solution for some of John Adams' thornier percussion parts, and when I worked on some projects with David setting Adams' pieces, David showed me how he did this for the percussion parts. I then had to use this technique myself when working on those pieces. So I have David Ocker and John Adams to thank for showing me this technique, which, as complex as it may seem, is really the only way to solve this for two players reading from a single part. Now, there's another complexity here. Ives wrote that the extra parts aren't necessarily to be played by players in the violin 2 section, but instead by players who are separated from the main orchestra by some distance. And this is not the only passage in the movement where there's independent music for the extra violin 2. It exists elsewhere throughout the second movement, so every time it happens, it's assigned to this desk, desk 6. But optionally, it can be played by two players who are spatially separated from the main orchestra. So, there's a separate extra violin 2 part for spatially removed players. That part only reproduces the music that the extra violin 2 players need to play. It doesn't reproduce any of the violin 2 section music, so it's a distinct part. I've seen that part used in performance quite successfully and to great visual effect for the audience, so it's very helpful to have in the part set. Now, one last thing. Because the appearance of the split page notation may surprise the desk 6 players, with the surprise happening during a Tuesday morning rehearsal for a Thursday evening concert, and may create a lot of concern and questions for them. Peter Edfish, who premiered the edition in 2012, was curious about how it appeared to the players, and once he saw it, he correctly anticipated that there would be lots of questions about it. So he asked me if the pages from the part corresponding to the passage we've been discussing could be reproduced in the front of the full score so that he and other conductors could see those pages in advance. That way, they'd be prepared for any questions coming from those players. This inspired me to create this section in the front, part pages that may require explanation. It's not the most eloquent title, but it gets the point across. It explains the violin parts to the section we've been discussing, along with other thorny parts for other instruments that might also create questions for the players. It accomplishes two things. One is that it eliminates the need for players to bring these parts to the conductor's podium for discussion. During the rehearsal, if the player has a question, the conductor can flip to this section of the score and look at the part page that the player is describing, with no need for the player to bring the part to the conductor in the middle of the rehearsal. The other thing it accomplishes is it allows the conductor to study these part pages in advance and see precisely what the players will see. That way, the conductor will know, going into the first rehearsal, the kinds of questions that may come up, and may be able to answer the players' questions with or without having to flip to this section of the front matter. So here you see the 2-page violin spread at the bottom of this page of the essay, with a written-out explanation of the mechanics of the part preceding it. Other part pages that are difficult follow this example, along with accompanying explanations. This has helped conductors and players ever since it was included in the edition, and I have Peter Edfish to thank for suggesting it. Now that we've disambiguated the passage, let's listen to it in a recent recording of the new edition.